If you've been asking yourself, am I awakening or am I actually going crazy? You're not alone and you're not broken. This question shows up at a very specific moment, usually after something shifts. Maybe the meditation retreat went deeper than you expected. Maybe the ceremony opened something that won't close. Maybe you had a spontaneous experience no one warned you about. And now your old ways of coping don't work anymore. Your thoughts feel impossibly loud. Your emotions, unfamiliar, overwhelming. Your family thinks you need a psychiatrist. Your spiritual teacher says, trust the process. And you're terrified the wrong choice will make everything worse. Here's the scariest part. Not knowing what category this belongs in. Because it doesn't look like enlightenment, and it doesn't look like illness either. Researchers tracked people who went through this exact fear. Different backgrounds, different beliefs, different triggers, same question. And what they discovered wasn't that something was wrong with them, but that they were hitting a predictable transition point that almost no one explains properly. I'm James, a guide here at the Catalyst Arc, and I'm going to show you something the mainstream conversation about spiritual crisis is completely missing. Not so you can label yourself, but so you can orient yourself. Before we go further, this is not medical advice, not a diagnosis, and not a claim of awakening. It's a translation of patterns meant to help you orient, not label yourself. Always consult healthcare professionals. If you're in this space right now, this video is here to help you slow things down and understand what's actually happening. Starting with why the question itself keeps you trapped. Let me show you a pattern. A man wakes up one morning with unmistakable feeling of disgust toward his boring family, his boring job, his boring self-identity. After years of faithful service as father, husband, employee, he spontaneously wanders into a nearby nature reserve. No food, no water, no essential supplies. Almost as if guided by something greater than himself. 5 days pass. He returns to his understandably distressed family with tattered clothes, wild eyes, and stories of divinity, of contact with the true essence of his soul. Now, same event, 3 different observers. Observer 1, the psychiatrist. Acute psychotic episode, likely brief psychotic disorder. Grandiose delusions, lack of insight. Immediate intervention required. Antipsychotic medication, possible hospitalization. Observer 2, the spiritual teacher. Spontaneous awakening, ego death, divine calling. This is exactly what the mystics describe. Support the process. Do not suppress. Breakthrough, not break down. Observer 3, the family. He's abandoned us. He's having a crisis. He's lost his mind. We want the old him back. Same event, 3 completely different interpretations. And here's the kicker. All 3 could be simultaneously accurate. Schrodinger's spiritual emergency, if you will. The question isn't which observer is correct. The question is, what does each interpretation enable or prevent? And more importantly, what does the research actually show about what helps people integrate? Because it turns out, the label matters far less than the response. Here's what's fascinating. We've been having this philosophical debate for decades. Spiritual emergency versus psychosis. Transformation versus pathology. 2 camps. Irreconcilable frameworks. But researchers who've actually worked with people navigating these crises have documented patterns. Stanislav and Christina Grof, who coined the term spiritual emergency in the 1980s. They founded the Spiritual Emergency Network specifically because people having profound spiritual openings were being pathologized and medicated, and it was preventing integration. Their work spans over 50 years, thousands of cases, clinical practice, research, and direct support. Dr. David Lukoff, clinical psychologist who himself went through what would be diagnosed as acute schizophrenia at age 22. Instead of being hospitalized and medicated, he had friends who understood mystical states. He went on to get his PhD, become a professor, and create the diagnostic criteria for religious or spiritual problem. Published research, peer-reviewed papers, decades of clinical work. Bonnie Greenwell, transpersonal psychologist who worked with thousands of kundalini awakening cases over her career, documented what helps, what makes things worse, what the patterns are. Phil Borges, photographer and researcher who spent 25 years interviewing shamans across 40 indigenous cultures, found the same pattern everywhere: crisis, elder support, integration, service. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, psychologists who've researched post-traumatic growth for decades, published the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory in 1996, widely cited, validated across populations. And Dr. Catherine Lucas, founder of the Spiritual Crisis Network, author of In Case of Spiritual Emergency, decades of work supporting people through these experiences. Different researchers, different populations, different decades. But when you look at their work, patterns emerge. Certain approaches consistently help, others consistently don't. Let me show you what they found. So, what do people who successfully integrate these experiences consistently report as helpful? I'm going to walk you through patterns documented across multiple published sources. Understanding and context. First, and this appears in every framework, understanding what's happening. Stanislav Grof writes in Spiritual Emergency, the single most important factor is recognizing the experience as a potential healing and transformative process, not pathology. Simply knowing, this is what Grof calls spiritual emergency, or this is kundalini awakening, described in yogic traditions, shifts the entire experience. From, I'm going insane, to, I'm going through a documented process. David Lukoff's own documented case. His friends gave him books. Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, Carl Jung, William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. That contextual understanding, seeing his experience reflected in mystical literature, was essential to his integration. Bonnie Greenwell emphasizes in The Kundalini Guide, first step is always education. This is Kundalini awakening. It's documented. It's natural. It's not psychosis. Knowledge alone doesn't complete the process, but it fundamentally changes the relationship to what's happening. Environment and grounding. Calm, safe environment, emphasized across all frameworks. The Grofs write specifically, reduce stimulation, safe space, not chaotic, not overwhelming. Sometimes simply being in a quiet, supportive environment allows the process to complete naturally. Time in nature. Bonnie Greenwell specifically recommends this throughout the Kundalini Guide. Grounding, bare feet on earth, natural rhythms. The body responds to nature in ways that support integration. Grounding practices appear in Grof's work, Greenwell's work, clinical integration frameworks. Simple things. Feel your feet, notice your breath, eat warm, nourishing food, gentle movement. Not exotic techniques, basic nervous system support. The right support. Finding people who understand, critical across all research. Lukoff's documented case, friends who didn't panic, who didn't immediately insist on hospitalization, who could hold space for the experience without fear. Phil Borges' indigenous research, elder who's been through it. I know what this is. You're not crazy. This happened to me. I'll guide you. That recognition from someone who's navigated it successfully changes everything. The Groffs founded Spiritual Emergency Network in 1980 specifically to provide this. People who understand these experiences, won't pathologize, can offer proper support. Catherine Lucas continues this work through the Spiritual Crisis Network today. Not everyone can hold this space. Finding the right people is essential. What not to do during acute phase? This is important. If intensive meditation or spiritual practice triggered the crisis, multiple sources caution against using the same practice to try to stabilize. Bonnie Greenwell specifically writes, "Don't force more kundalini activation when you're already overwhelmed. Don't do intensive breathwork if breathwork triggered the crisis. Sometimes the nervous system needs to settle before continuing the practice that opened the door." Groff's work emphasizes this. Sometimes reducing spiritual practice intensity temporarily allows integration to catch up with activation. Body-centered approaches, somatic work, emphasized throughout Groff's framework. The body holds the experience. Talk therapy alone is often insufficient. Greenwell's work emphasizes gentle movement, yoga, walking, dance, ways to move energy through the body rather than letting it stagnate. Creative expression. Groff emphasizes this in Spiritual Emergency. Art, writing, music, movement, ways to process and express what cannot be verbalized. The process often needs multiple channels, not just cognitive understanding. Practical daily support. Basic self-care appears across all frameworks but bears emphasis. Lukoff's friends made sure he ate, slept when possible, maintained basic functioning. Greenwell emphasizes in the Kundalini Guide proper nutrition, reduced stimulants, caffeine, alcohol, sugar, recreational drugs. Not as spiritual discipline, as nervous system support. When the system is overwhelmed, basics matter enormously. Time and patience. Integration takes time. Consistent finding across all sources. Lukoff's documented timeline: 2 months for the acute phase to resolve, years for full integration of the experience. Groff's research: days to months for basic societal adjustment, functioning at work, in relationships. Months to years for complete psycho-spiritual integration, truly understanding and embodying what emerged. Phil Borges' indigenous research: initiation itself can take weeks to months, then lifelong integration of the gifts and responsibilities that emerged. Tedeschi and Calhoun's post-traumatic growth research: growth doesn't happen immediately after trauma. It happens through the struggle with the aftermath, the active processing, the meaning-making, the integration work. These patterns appear across Groff's 50-plus years of research and thousands of cases, Lukoff's published academic work and personal documentation, Greenwell's clinical practice with Kundalini awakening, Borges's cross-cultural documentation, Tedeschi and Calhoun's validated psychological research, Lucas's decades with Spiritual Crisis Network, different populations, different methodologies, different cultural contexts. Same core elements emerge. Now, what do these researchers consistently observe as less helpful or potentially problematic? This is where it gets provocative. Immediate pharmaceutical intervention as first-line response. The Groffs specifically caution against this in Spiritual Emergency. They write, standard psychiatric treatment, particularly heavy antipsychotic medication, can suppress the process and prevent the natural resolution that would occur with proper support. Important context. They're not saying medication is never necessary. They're saying it's often used too quickly, in situations where supportive environment and understanding might allow natural integration. Traditional psychiatric hospitalization. unless absolutely necessary for safety. The Groffs document cases where people were hospitalized for experiences that would have resolved in supportive home environments. The hospital setting itself, sterile, institutional, treating the experience as pathology, can worsen and prolong the crisis. Pathologizing the experience, treating it as nothing but brain malfunction. David Lukoff's work emphasizes the interpretation matters enormously. Same experience interpreted as psychotic break requiring suppression versus spiritual emergency requiring support leads to radically different outcomes. Isolation, consistently problematic across all research. Phil Borges's work shows, in indigenous cultures, you're never isolated during initiation. Community holds you, elder guides you. Western tendency to isolate people during psychological crisis, whether through hospitalization or social stigma, directly contradicts what integration requires. Premature return to normal functioning. Groff and Greenwell both caution against this. The cultural pressure to get back to normal immediately can force suppression rather than integration. Sometimes, the system needs weeks or months of reduced external demands to complete the process. What was consistently more helpful than standard psychiatric intervention? Bodywork, massage, somatic therapies, alternative practitioners who understood these frameworks, spiritual communities with proper boundaries and understanding, time in nature, creative expression, approaches that work with the process rather than suppress it.
This creates a significant challenge in Western culture, because standard protocol when someone presents with altered states, unusual experiences, strong emotions, sleep disruption, is immediate psychiatric intervention and medication. But the research from people who successfully integrated suggests that approach often prevents the very integration that would lead to growth. Let me show you a fully documented case. This is public record, published, verifiable. Dr. David Lukoff, now clinical psychologist, professor, published researcher. In 1971, at age 22, he had a consciousness-expanding experience that triggered what any psychiatrist would diagnose as acute schizophrenic disorder. He believed he was Buddha and Christ simultaneously, wrote a holy book, distributed it in the streets of Berkeley, had profound mystical visions for several weeks. His psychiatric evaluation: acute schizophrenic disorder with religious delusions. Recommend immediate hospitalization and antipsychotic medication. But Lukoff had friends who understood mystical literature. Instead of hospitalizing him, they did something different. Gave him books. Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, William James. Helped him see, this is what mystics throughout history have experienced. You're having a documented phenomenon, not a brain disease. Provided calm environment. Made sure he ate, slept when possible. Didn't argue with his beliefs. Didn't try to reality check him out of the experience. Just held space. Provided context. Waited. 2 months later, the acute phase resolved. But here's what's remarkable. Lukoff didn't just recover and return to baseline. He went on to get his PhD in clinical psychology, become a professor and researcher, publish peer-reviewed papers on differentiating spiritual crises from mental illness, create the diagnostic criteria for religious or spiritual problem, successfully lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to recognize experiences like his as non-pathological. So, the question: did Lukoff have acute schizophrenia that spontaneously remitted and coincidentally led to a 40-year career studying the exact phenomenon he experienced? Or did he have a spiritual emergency that, Because his friends provided exactly what research now identifies as essential support, integrated successfully and led to post-traumatic growth. The interpretation shaped the intervention shaped the outcome, and his experience is now published in academic literature as a documented case of successful spiritual crisis integration. Another documented case. This one has over 2.6 million views. Eleanor Longden. TED Talk 2013. The Voices in My Head. Started hearing voices in college. Told her psychiatrist. Received diagnosis: schizophrenia. Standard treatment pathway: antipsychotic medication. Symptoms worsened. Increased medication. Hospitalized. More medication. Eventually, barely functional. On disability. Standard outcome for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. But then she encountered someone who asked a different question. Not, how do we make the voices stop? But, what are the voices trying to tell you? And when she actually listened to what the voices were saying, they were processing childhood sexual abuse she'd never consciously addressed. The voices weren't random psychotic symptoms generating meaningless content. They were parts of her psyche, holding trauma she couldn't yet integrate consciously. Once she understood that, worked with trauma-informed therapy, learned to dialogue with the parts instead of suppressing them, she integrated. Came off medication over time. Now, PhD psychologist, published researcher, international speaker on hearing voices and recovery. Same initial diagnosis as thousands of people on permanent psychiatric disability. Different interpretation of the symptoms, different intervention approach, radically different outcome. Now, here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. One more documented case, from Phil Borges' documentary, Crazy Wise. Ekaya Esima, young woman in New York who experienced what psychiatry would call a severe psychotic break. Voices telling her to harm herself. Visions of deceased people appearing in her room. Extreme sensitivity to sounds and music. She locked herself in a room for months, took the light bulb out, completely isolated. Was hospitalized, put on heavy antipsychotic medication, gained 70 pounds in 2.5 months. The side effects were devastating. Then someone recognized what was happening differently. A South African Sangoma, a traditional healer, told Ekaya, "This isn't mental illness. This is Thwaza, a calling to become a healer. You have priesthood responsibilities." So Ekaya made a choice. She came off the medications and entered traditional Sangoma training in Baltimore. What psychiatry called voices, the training helped her understand as ancestral communication. What the diagnosis called visions, the framework reframed as spiritual perception. The training wasn't easy. She had to face her fears, her pain, the difficult emotions she'd been carrying. Today, documented in the film, Ekaya works as a traditional healer. Not on medication, not disabled. She knows who she is and why she's here. To help others who've experienced similar crises. And here's the pattern Phil Borges documented through cases like Ekaya's. When these experiences are given a meaningful framework, guidance from someone who's been through it, and community support, instead of suppression, isolation, and medication, integration becomes possible. Same crisis, 2 responses. Response 1. You have a broken brain. Here's your label. Here's your medication. Manage your symptoms. This is chronic. Response 2. You're going through something. What does it mean? What support do you need? What might you become on the other side? The research on post-traumatic growth. People who actively struggle with crisis don't just return to baseline. They develop capacities they didn't have before. Greater appreciation for life, deeper relationships, spiritual deepening, recognition of new possibilities. Not despite the crisis, through it. One response creates that. The other prevents it. If this landed, hit the like button. It tells YouTube to show this to more people who need it, and drop a comment, especially if you've been through something like this. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. There's another video on why the voice targets sensitive people specifically. Why what feels like weakness might actually be something else entirely. Link on screen. Thanks for watching.